Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for everyone for attending. And I'd especially like to thank the audience because we live in a strange world where people just read a headline and think it's the truth, and the journalists aren't really checking anything. So you're one of the extreme minority who actually are interested in hearing science and facts before you make up your mind. So I applaud you for that. That's it's a rare quality, and I respect it. So let's leap into the talk. First of all, people ask me what my motivation is. They'll ask me if I'm being paid by Exxon or something to defend the oil industry. And the reason I'm into this topic is that my children were being taught lies at school. My children came home and they were told that plastics lasted 1,000 years in the environment. And as a polymer scientist, I know that a plastic bag degrades in under 1 year in the environment. So that's kind of a large disparity. And I realized that if we bring up our children believing a set of lies, we're going to have them voting for strange things, and it's just not a good way to to propagate humanity. So I decided that made me angry. I don't care particularly much about the environment. I'm not passionate enough about it. Let's put it that way. I care about as much as a normal person. I'm not passionate enough about the environment to write a book and read 1,000 articles to get the facts, and I'm not passionate enough about plastics to do that either. What motivates this is the anger of having my children taught lies and realizing that the teachers have been taught lies, they don't know any better, and that lay people have no place to get the information. And you'll find a scientist who knows about one topic, litter, for example. You might find someone who knows about microplastics, but nobody's really brought it together in one place so that you can understand the whole picture. And you have to see the holistic picture to come up with sensible conclusions. So that's what this is all about. I've now got about 2,000 data sources altogether, mostly peer-reviewed LCA studies and scientific articles. So everything I say is not an opinion. It's backed by scientific references on the slide and many more on the website. So with that, I think I'll leap in and try to show you, the facts and give a little perspective on some of these topics that we hear so much about. If I can convince the slide to forward, that would be great. So here's an example. We've all been told that Americans use 500 million straws a day, and this fact in inverted commas, was repeated by USA Today, CNN, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and the New York Times. And it's 100% rubbish. A 9-year-old schoolboy made it up for a school project, and all of these esteemed institutes just copied it. And the reason is everyone just wants clicks. They're selling advertising. They want to put anything in the headline that will make you click, and they can't be bothered to check it. So everyone's believing things which are just based on fiction, because the professional journalists that we used to have, who had credibility and had to double check everything and have colleagues check their sources, all of that's gone. It's all about clicks now. So a sensational headline is all you need, and nobody bothers to check it. And studies have shown that if you repeat a lie again and again, even the smartest people will believe that lie after a while. It just breaks you down, and you'll believe this nonsense. And that's just where we are now. We're 10 years on since these lies about plastics started, and there hasn't been really any concerted pushback. And now everyone believes the lies. So it's really an uphill battle to change people's minds once they've been made up. But nevertheless, I'm a warrior for truth and justice and a scientist, so I still want to get the facts out there, even if people already have made up their minds. So this is from a 9-year schoolboy called Milo Kress. Just pretty much made that number up. He didn't have any evidence to back it up. And the number's wrong. It's been checked. The real number's far less than that. So people are more than willing to believe nonsense if it sounds dramatic, and we see that even in the political sphere. We see, people being elected just based on whatever fiction suits the audience. So what do we do about it? We try and go and look for the evidence. And the first thing to ask, people think that plastics are not green. So the first thing I ask myself is, well, how do you prove that? Are plastics green or aren't they? It can't be a matter of opinion. It should be a matter of scientific fact. And the only real way to tell whether something is green is something called a life cycle analysis, or a life cycle report, a life cycle assessment. There's different words for it. But this is an ISO regulated thing. There's a scientific procedure for it, and it's checked and peer reviewed by people, so you can't easily fudge one. And this is accepted, right? The governments use it, companies use it, and even environmental groups rely on life cycle analysis to tell us what's true and what isn't. And a life cycle analysis, lay people don't tend to know what it is. So here it is in a simplistic form. So you start with the raw materials of whatever it is that you're trying to analyze. Let's say it's a paper bag or a plastic bag. You start with the raw materials, and you take the manufacturing all of the CO2 that goes into the manufacturing, the pollution that's created. You take the transportation and the energy that's burned to transport the material, and the use in function. For example, plastic in a car may take oil to make, but you may end up saving way more oil because you've made the car lighter, so you're burning less petrol. So it considers the whole thing, not just the amount of energy and pollution to create the material, but the whole life cycle of the material in use, including repairs and including waste disposal. So this is a giant misconception. People will tell me life cycle analysis rubbish because it doesn't consider waste disposal, and that's just not true. Life cycle analysis has about 18 different factors considering pretty much the whole thing. In the old days, it didn't include everything. You could sort of pick and choose, but in these days, all modern life cycle analyses have all these factors. So it's pretty much considering everything. So let's add all of this stuff up and see what's green and what isn't. And what do we find when we do that? I've got about 0.5 gigabyte of life cycle analyses. I've been told I've got the largest collection of life cycle analyses and scientific information on this topic anywhere in the world. And that was by a Fortune 100 company who has a whole department working on this. So I'm very thorough when I start leaping into things. And this is what we find when we look at an LCA of grocery bags. So I started searching on Google, and you can do it too, right? You can type in LCA shopping bag or LCA grocery bag into Google, and you'll find some of the same hits that I did. And overall, I found 24 of these studies, and I sent them to a guy called Neil Shackleton at Medulla, who does nothing but life cycle analysis for his full-time job. He's a fellow of the Institute of Mining and Minerals and so forth. And he's an expert, right? So because I'm not a super expert in LCA, and I sent him these 24, every one I could ever find, not cherry pick, just every single one. And I said, here you go, Neil, look at this. And he said, yes, plastics are unequivocally the greenest answer to shopping bags, right? It's not even close. They beat the heck out of paper bags, and cotton bags are disastrous, especially organic cotton bags. You'd have to reuse one 200 times to break even with a single-use polyethylene bag. So this is a bit of a shocker, right? Everyone's telling us that plastic bags are bad. They're telling us that they're a scourge on the environment and we have to ban them, and they are being banned. And then we look at the science and we find that there are 24 peer-reviewed studies, and we're talking, 3 in America, 1 in Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Australia, and every single one agrees that the plastic bag is greenest. And that's worrying to me, right? The science is clearly telling us that we need to protect the environment by using plastic, and the environmentalists, so-called environmentalists, are campaigning for the exact opposite. And if you remember back to the nuclear disaster, that was the same thing. They campaigned for years against nuclear power, and now it turns out that nuclear power has to be a component of any green energy system, or they don't work, because solar panels and wind don't work 24 hours a day. So now they're doing the exact opposite. People have realized that if you want to take care of the environment, we do need nuclear power. So this is a trend, right? These people go off and they say sensationalist things in order to get funding, and they're just not true. And if you write to them, which I've done, I've written to the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace and people and said, excuse me, could you correct your website because the things you've written there aren't true, and I've got 24 studies to prove it. And guess what? They're not interested. They have no interest in science or the truth. They're only interested, it would seem, in making money by putting up sensational headlines and making people angry enough to donate. So that's unfortunate, and that's why we need talks like this one for the few people who really do care about science and the facts to get the truth and act based on that. Because if we act based on lies, there won't be a happy outcome. It's damaging the environment to follow the advice that we're getting now. So here are some numbers. If you were to replace plastic bags with paper bags, you would need about 3 times more energy. You'd make way more CO2. You have way more water usage. And you'd have to cut down millions and millions more trees, 2 million more trees a year just in Europe to replace plastic bags with paper bags. And the ironic thing is the Swedish guy who patented the plastic bag wanted to save trees. His whole goal was to save trees and save the forests by replacing paper bags with plastic bags. And he succeeded. And now we're going back again and erasing everything he did by using paper bags. And as one example, I went to the local supermarket and I weighed a grocery bag from Kroger, right? It weighs 5.5 grams for a paper bag, for a plastic bag. Plastic bag, 5.5 grams. That's about as much as 1 game die. If you took a game die from Monopoly, that's about 5.5 grams of plastic. And then I weighed the paper bag and it was 60 grams, right? It does the exact same job. As we can see, it's worse for the environment and generates 10 times more waste. And this is what people are campaigning for. It's truly mind-boggling. Here's another area. We can't cover every single area because I've got so many LCAs and so many different topics, but here's another one that comes up all the time. Should we be using PET bottles or aluminium or glass? And here's an analysis, and as we can see, let's look at the energy. Plastic uses about, if we were to go from plastic, PET at the bottom here with 11 energy units, if we were to go to aluminium cans, we'd have to use 50% more energy. If we went to bottles, we'd use 2.5 times more energy. And don't forget, this energy is coming from oil and coal and burning CO2, right? So this is not clean energy that we have these days. This is dirty energy. So that's a big deal. We're creating way more CO2, as we can see on the right here. So if we go from 1,000 to 4,000, that's about 4.5 times more CO2 to make a glass bottle, and 2.5 times more to make an aluminium can. So in every single respect, the PET bottle is better, and yet people are still, to this day, posting, get rid of nasty PET and use a glass jar, or use an aluminium can. And it's just not good advice, and it's not green. And the reason is easy to understand when you see, this is one study, but there are more studies than this that come to the same conclusion. So, and that's another thing I do, right? If you, literally, you can present 16 life cycle analyses on plastic bags, which is how many I'd found when I wrote the book. And people will say, oh, you've been cherry picking. This is not true. And I'll say to them, well, where are your life cycle analyses? Where is your data? And they don't have any. They can't bring me a single life cycle analysis that says the opposite. So, and this is the same with this one, right? You'll show this data and say, oh, well, you don't believe Franklin Associates for whatever reason, because they don't want to. They've got cognitive dissonance. They've already decided one thing, and they'll do anything to contort their mind and reject the facts. And so that's why in my book, I've got so many data sources and on the website, because I want to make absolutely sure that this isn't an outlier. I haven't cherry-picked anything to prove my point. I've instead read 2,000 articles and then made up my mind based on science. That's what real scientists do. So here's why these bottles take so much energy to produce. This is basically, you take what's equivalent to molten lava, right, which is melted glass. It's glowing red hot at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. And that's the energy input you need to make glass. So when you look at this, it's very easy to understand why you're not green when you're making glass. Even recycling glass is not always green. And here's making the metal, right? You're taking things which are red hot at thousands of degrees with huge energy usage to make these things. Whereas when you extrude a piece of plastic, as anyone in our industry knows, it's a couple hundred degrees, not a couple thousand. And there's nothing glowing red hot. It's much, much, much lower energy and much, much greener for that and other reasons. Less waste and so on, as we said. So this is not something difficult to understand, right? If you were to say to somebody, what do you think's greener? Something that's glowing red hot, that's bursting into flames and you've had to heat it to thousands of degrees, or something that you could melt in your own frying pan at home, a regular person should be able to understand the difference in energy. So of all the life cycle analyses, which I've got, as I said, about 0.5 gigabyte of these things, so I've looked at all kinds of areas, and this is the overall trend that I see. Wood, if you can use a piece of wood, that is the greenest thing to use. So if you look at wood decking, on your porch, that is the greenest option. And if you look at wine corks, natural cork wood is the greenest option. It's greener than the plastic cork. And here's an example, right? I'm a scientist. I find that wood is the winner in this case. And I tell you, right, because that's what real scientists do. Lobbyists don't do that. They just tell you what funds their pockets, what fills their pockets, and they're not really interested in the truth, and they would just brush that under the carpet. But I'm, full disclosure, if we want to be green and you want to make a deck, you should probably make it out of wood. And so that's only for a hunk of wood though, right? Once you start doing things to the wood, making paper, for example, there's a lot more energy, a lot more chemicals and things like that. So that changes. But if you can literally make your product out of a hunk of wood, that's usually the greenest thing. And next comes plastics, which is the greenest thing in most real cases. So for example, your telephone's going to be made of plastic, not a hunk of wood. Same for your cars and so forth. If you made it out of wood, it would be incredibly heavy and probably not work very well. So plastics are the greenest thing in many cases, just because they're so versatile and they use less energy and create less waste and so forth. And then paper and cardboard. Sometimes paper cardboard will win over plastic. There's some analyses by Tetra Pak, for example, showing that their Tetra Pak containers can win over plastic in certain cases. And that may well be true. I haven't looked into that in detail, but I do see that paper and cardboard can be the winner in some cases. But if you look at straws, for example, plastic easily wins that one. Steel, and then aluminium, and then glass. So that's the trend that I tend to see looking at hundreds of these things overall. And so this is good to know, right? This is good to know that plastic is usually the greenest solution for the things that we're considering in everyday life. And yet we're being told that they're bad for the environment. So the effect of being driven, this is ironic, right? The best people, or the people who care the most, the really caring people who are considerate and they want to help the environment, are all going to paper and steel and aluminium and glass because they think it's the right thing to do. So that's ironic, right? The people who care the most are doing the most harm because they've been lied to. And it's very hard to change their minds, as we said. Okay, so let's look at waste. What do we know about waste? So I had to read again tons and tons of articles about waste to understand what's going on here and get to the facts. This is what we're told. We're drowning in plastic. But what's the reality? Here's the reality. Plastics are about 13% of solid municipal waste. That's down here. So paper is twice as much. Paper and cardboard, twice as much waste as plastics, and I've never seen a single headline about it. It's like the paper industry's got Harry Potter's invisibility cloak on. It's the biggest scandal I've ever seen, right? It's less green than plastic on average, and it generates twice as much waste, and not a single word said about it. Food generates a huge amount of waste as well. Yard trimmings. And a thing that's not on here is rubble. Building rubble is enormous. So if you look at the book called Rubbish, ! They analysed what's in landfills, and they said that if you took paper and building rubbish together, that's more than 50% of overall waste. So that means plastics is about 10% overall once you add in building rubble, because it's similar to the paper at 25%. So plastics is about 10% of overall solid waste. This is only solid municipal waste as defined by the EPA in the US. That's why it says 13 here, because it doesn't count the rubble. So we can see there are a lot of sources of waste, and this is puzzling, right? Plastics is definitely a major contributor here, but why are we focusing 100% of our money, 100% of our attention? If you look at LinkedIn, you'll see 100% of the posts are about plastic, never about paper, never, sometimes about food, one or two, never about yard trimmings, never about metal, never about rubber and leather. It's incredible. How are we going to solve a waste problem by focusing on 10% of the problem? Focusing 100% of our money and marketing and efforts. We've got whole people like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's doing a wonderful job, but even they seem to only post about plastics. And you can't solve a problem by only looking at 10% of it. It doesn't make any sense. So this is what I said about perspective, right? You have to keep things in perspective, and this is what the slide does. And here's something absolutely fascinating. This is on the EPA's website right now. There's a link underneath. You can go and look it up yourself. And what we found was that waste generation over the decades has been monitored. So we started the 60s, and it used to be that the waste per person in the solid line went up linearly pretty much over time. We're making more and more waste per person. And then in 1990, it went flat. So the waste per person suddenly stopped being a linear increase, and it plateaued off. And so this has been analyzed in the paper, which I referenced below, and they wanted to know why was that the case? Why are we producing much, much less waste per person than we used to? And the reason is plastics. And this is the ironic part, right? In the 1990s and the 80s, plastics use went up by 84 times between 1960 and 2013. And at the same time, the total waste per person has gone way down because we've been replacing metal and glass and these less green things with plastics that generate less waste. So this is an amazing fact, right? So people are saying we're drowning in plastic. Plastic's responsible for all of our waste problems. And the actual fact is plastic is 10% of solid waste, and it's dramatically reduced our overall waste. And this is published, right, and proven and peer-reviewed. And so they've done studies on this. It takes 3 or 4 pounds of other material to replace 1 pound of plastic on average, right? So if you think the solution to the world's problems is to get rid of plastic, you're going to run into a horrible shock because it's just not true. And here's an example, right? This is what would happen if you were to take the plastic piece on top of this distribution. So this is the chart we had before showing the amount of different waste, and plastic is the blue one. Let's take the blue one away and replace it with something that's 3 or 4 times higher by stretching the other ones upwards. And this is what we see. We would go from having this pile on the left, which is, we generate waste. We're a modern society. We generate too much waste. That's correct. We should reduce it. Absolutely correct. But if we remove the plastic part, we would generate far more waste than we do today. Especially the food waste is important because food takes an enormous amount of energy and CO2 and so forth to make. So generating more food waste would be awful for the environment. So another fallacy dispelled. Now let's look at waste mismanagement. Here's a graph. And we see that the dark colored countries are the ones that produce the most waste. And so we're made to feel very bad. Oh, you live in America, open your pockets, give us your donations. You're awful people. You're generating a lot of waste. Same with Europe, same with some parts of Asia, right? So we should feel terrible about ourselves. We're generating all this waste. But now let's look at the next slide. What do we see? These are the countries actually mismanaging waste. And we see that the very same countries that are making the most waste from the last slide are the ones who are not mismanaging any waste. Pretty much, a couple percent. So there's no reason to feel bad, right? You can make as much waste as you want if you manage it properly, and that's exactly what's happening. So the countries which are mismanaging their waste and pumping it all into the ocean are these ones in dark blue. It's 10 rivers in Asia and Africa are putting all of that rubbish into the oceans. And meanwhile, the green groups are trying to make people in America and Europe feel bad and open their pockets to donate for a problem that they did not create. Because who would you go after, right? It's the same as the lawyers. They go after the deep pockets, and the green groups do the same thing. They go after the people with the guilty consciences and too much money, and they don't know what to do with it, and they try and guilt them into donating for something which they have not, they haven't created. So this is not the way the world should work, but that's what we're seeing today. And I know some of you are thinking, okay, I know that there's some plastic waste that's being shipped abroad and mismanaged there. And that's true, that has happened, but I know it's being cracked down on. I don't think anyone was sending waste away and saying, here, dispose of this in your country and throw it in the river. I don't think that was the case. I think people were, sending stuff away. People were buying their waste to reprocess it and not acting responsibly. So as far as I know, that nobody was willingly sending stuff away to dump in the ocean. They could have just dumped it in their own ocean if they wanted to do that. So here's another case where we're being horribly misinformed. And let's look at litter, right? People literally look at a candy bar on the ground and they want to call Nestle, and they see a water bottle or a Coke bottle. They want to blame Coca-Cola for this litter. And that's ridiculous. I mean, my 10-year-old kids know better than to look at a piece of rubbish and blame the rubbish. That is pathetic. Whoever, and I literally have people arguing with me on LinkedIn about this. Oh, no, it's Coca-Cola's fault. We need supplier responsibility, or it's Procter & Gamble's fault, Unilever's fault, Nestle's fault. What a load of rubbish. We know from studies that 81% of the litter dropped in America is dropped intentionally. They literally sit there in a car, the observers, and watch these people drop it on the floor and then turn around and blame the rubbish, because people will never blame themselves. They can never look in the mirror and say, hey, I'm the problem. It's not Nestle or Coke or Procter & Gamble or Unilever. It's me. Nobody's going to do that. So they rather blame the litter. And I find it pathetic. It's naive and it's very non-productive. So we know that litter is a human problem. It's got nothing to do with these objects. We're always told about plastic making its way into the ocean, or this or that and the other. Nothing's growing flippers and flying or growing wings and flying out of rubbish bins. This is human behavior. It's proven, and it has to stop. It has to be education in schools, and it has to be massive fines. If it were up to me, any litterer would have to do litter duty on their own street in front of their neighbors for a month, right, with a big fluorescent shirt on saying, I'm a litterer. And see how much littering you get then. If that's the penalty, $10,000 and having to do litter duty in front of your neighbors for a month, I think littering would stop pretty quickly. So here's another thing when it comes to litter. Problem with plastic bags especially is that they look enormous, right? So we see these huge ugly bags, and I find them extremely ugly. There's hardly anything uglier than a plastic bag. Just one in my kitchen and the whole kitchen looks to be a mess. So we see this giant blob on the right, which is the plastic bag, and on the left is how much plastic it really is, 5 or 6 grams, right? The same as a game die. So this is an optical illusion we're seeing because the plastic bag is so thin. We see this giant ball of plastic, but in reality, it's just this tiny little cube. So this is a problem. It's like a magic trick that our brains are confused. We still have primitive brains from the African savannah, basically, from when we were evolved. We see this giant thing on the right and we think there's a lot of litter, and really what we're looking at is this little cube on the left. So that's one of the issues that plastics face. And here's just to drive home the point, because people will still say to me, no, litter can't be due to people. It has to be due to materials. So here's an example I thought of. We've been using plastic banknotes. Not all of them, but many countries have been using plastic banknotes for years, and they print 8 billion a year, which is the same as the world population. So we're printing one of these plastic banknotes per person per year, and we have been for decades. How many of these plastic banknotes made of polypropylene do you find when you go for a walk in your park? Do you find them everywhere? Do you find them on the beach when you go for a swim on your holidays? Do you find them fluttering down out of the air as you're going along in your car? No, I've never seen one. I've never seen one. There's 8 billion printed a year for decades, and I've never seen one on the floor. And that proves to me that plastic is not the cause of litter. It's people, right? Because if you have a plastic piece like this and it has a value, nobody will drop it. They will look after it, and if it is dropped, somebody will pick it up, right? So that proves to you that a piece of plastic is only being dropped because somebody dropped it and was careless, because it didn't have enough value. And that is exactly why these deposit schemes work so well. So these have been produced for decades, 8 billion printed a year, one per person on the planet. You never see one on the street. And this is why these deposit systems work. So many countries are running these deposit schemes where you take a PET bottle, which is too cheap to bother recycling. They give it a value of whatever, $1 or 50 cents. They get 97% of them back. They recycle each one 12 times in Norway. And the whole system becomes incredibly green. PET bottle is the greenest solution to begin with. And when you recycle it, it becomes greener and greener and greener every recycling round you do. So this is incredibly efficient, and it does work. And that's because they assigned a value to that PET bottle in order that it's not disposed of by irresponsible people. And so we talk about beach litter. And so I look for studies on beach litter. What's the cause of beach litter? Here we have a stock image of a tourist beach, and you can even see the little McDonald's logo in the background there. And what's the cause of this beach litter? Well, they've studied it. And the cause of the beach litter is the people on the beach. Surprise, surprise. The tourists on the beach drop the stuff on the beach, and then they turn around and blame the litter and say, what a shocking thing. And then you know what they do? They move to a cleaner beach. Once the beach gets to a certain state, they say this is unacceptable, and they go to another pristine beach and they ruin that one. That's human behavior, and that's proven. What do we find when we look at an isolated beach that people don't go to? It looks a lot more like this. There's a lot less litter. This is a bit, I couldn't find a stock image with the exact amount, scientifically correct amount of litter to put on here. But the beaches look pretty much like this. And the things you do find is 1 or 2 bottles that have washed up from some fishing boat that's discarded it. That's been proven. And you find nets. You find fishing nets which have been discarded, by the fishing industry. And this has been known for a long time, and it's been regulated against, but obviously the regulations are not strict enough. People are cutting loose their nets and discarding them, not looking after them, and every now and then you'll get one washing up on a beach. So, but it looks completely different to the tourist beach, because the tourist beach is full of tourist litter, and you can prove that by analyzing the litter and seeing, in certain parts, like there's a place in Brazil where you'll find tons of skewers, like little wooden skewers, because they eat a certain dish there. So the litter you find on that beach is specific to the beach and caused by those people. And here, as I said earlier, is the problem, right? A guy drives his car into a tree, and who does he blame? Does he blame the tree? Yeah, he'll try and blame the tree. Oh, that tree shouldn't be there, and oh no, there's something wrong with my steering. I should have had my tires checked. There was a pigeon in the road. The last person that guy's ever going to do is to look in the mirror and realize, okay, I made a mistake. I wasn't paying attention. I was texting, and I went into a tree. It's just human nature. We'll blame anything but ourselves, and that's what we're doing with litter and plastics in particular. We're blaming an inanimate object for something that we did. And the longer we keep doing it, the first step in making progress, ask Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step in making progress with anything is to admit you have a problem, right? So the longer we keep blaming manufacturing companies and materials for litter, the longer that this disaster is going to go on, right? We need to blame the correct source of fault and then address that. If we blame the wrong things, we're never going to make progress. So the next topic I had to look into was ocean litter, microplastics. This is the image we're presented with, but is it true? So here's an actual analysis, and this has been studied for decades, right? So people have looked at these gyres we talked about. We're told that there are gyres, these swirling islands, floating islands. I saw just yesterday somebody posted, there's swirling islands twice the size of Texas, full of plastic, and this is why we have to crack down on this nasty plastic industry. So what do you find when you actually look at a scientific study where scientists have trawled these things back and forth, collected every piece of plastic for decades, analyzed it, quantified it, and here's what you see. Here are the different amounts of plastic. The short bars here are just regular ocean, right? How much you find in a regular part of the ocean. And it's hard to imagine how much this really is, but it's about, let's say that's 50 grams per square kilometer. right? So that's not very much. That's about the same as if you took 130 bathtubs of water and you had one piece of plastic the size of your fingernail. That's about how much plastic you find in a regular part of the ocean. If you look at these gyres, people have specifically said they don't exist, right? So here is there is no floating island, right? They don't exist. You can't find them. If you can swim through them and not see them, you can sail through them and not find them. You can look in from a satellite, and you won't find any floating islands the size of Texas. It's just pure fiction. They've made up this strong mental image to frighten people into giving donations and furthering their own cause. And it's absolutely shameful. There is not one piece of scientific evidence to support that. So they always pick, the green groups are very clever, right? They always pick polar bears or something you can't go and check on and say that it's a problem. Because if they pick something you could see, it would be obvious that they were lying. So here we go. Here's the amount of plastic in the North Pacific Gyre, and we've got about 250 grams per kilometer squared. And I'll give you some examples later on about how much that exactly is. I think that's on the next slide here. Okay. So it's been monitored for decades. It's not something new, and that's why I don't understand these people saying, I got on a fishing boat and I went out and we're studying plastics in the ocean. You're like, you don't need to do that. I understand you want to spend some time on a boat and virtue signal to your friends that you're a good person, but this has been studied by professional scientists for decades. We don't need extra people going out on boats and verifying that there's plastic floating in the ocean. So they claim that there are huge floating islands. We just saw in the last slide how much there actually is. It's about 2 pounds per square mile in the middle of these gyres, which is about, so in the worst parts, it's about one game die, like a Monopoly die, per Olympic-sized pool. That's in the worst parts, in the middle of these gyres, these so-called floating islands that don't exist. One game die. And I'm not saying it should be there. I'm just saying we shouldn't lie to people. We shouldn't make up stories about floating islands the size of Texas that don't exist to scare people into donating to unjust causes, right? It just doesn't make sense. There are articles showing that there's millions of tons of munitions, right? Bombs and chemical warfare. There's nerve gas in the ocean. Lethal chemicals. Nobody ever talks about it. They're obsessed by one game die per Olympic-sized swimming pool. So if we're going to solve the world's problems, we shouldn't start off by telling a bunch of lies to our kids. And we should look at the whole picture. What is in the ocean? How did it get there? And how do we stop it? You can't detect it by sailing or swimming through it. This is from NOAA, right, which is the government agency who looks after the oceans, who just say, no, these gyres people talk about don't exist. They literally say there is no gyre, there is no soup. There's even a site called Plastic Soup. It doesn't exist. There is no plastic soup. So this is an exaggerated problem, and it's being exaggerated by huge lobby groups who have their own interests at heart, and they have no pushback either. So if we're going to campaign against these very strong evocative images they have, we're going to have to come up with something pretty powerful ourselves. That's not my job, but if somebody wants to do it, then they would have to. I would like to see a picture of a baby in an incubator with a plastic mask on, and then take away the plastic and see what sort of emotional response that evokes in these people. Where would we really be without plastics? So microplastics is another very, very hot topic. And I analyzed a lot of microplastics articles, and this is actually where I was expecting to find that plastics were harmful. That's because I've seen so much, right? We all have. So I looked at the articles and I found out that almost all of it is just rubbish. I mean, such terrible scientists that these people should be thrown out of their academic positions and forced to pay the money back. And that's a bold claim, but if you go to my website, I specifically list papers and explain why it's appalling science that means nothing in each case. So I break it down by paper. And so here are the overall trends I see. The actual plastic in the ocean is polyethylene and polypropylene. Almost every study is on cross-linked polystyrene particles, right? So the wrong kind of plastic. They picked a kind of plastic which you can buy off the shelf because it's easy for them, but you don't find it in the ocean. They're studying the wrong plastic. The next thing that they do to make sure that plastic looks bad is they add up to 10 million times more than is really in the ocean to make sure that whatever fish or poor creature they're testing on suffers, right? They want to make sure that they see suffering and they see harm by using up to 10 million times too much plastic to make sure that they get some effect. They use the wrong size of plastic. They use particles that are far too small, and so on. So they do pretty much everything wrong, and then they say, oh, look, plastic is harmful, but it's a plastic that doesn't exist under unrealistic conditions. And if you do look at the realistic studies, the ones on polyethylene and polypropylene, they find, oh, look, there's no harm. And that should be no surprise, right? Because polyethylene, that's like a Ziploc bag or a grocery bag. Polypropylene is what the original Tupperware is made of. These are things that we eat our food out of. We know that they're safe, right? If you took a piece of Tupperware that's safe and cut it in half, right, and made a smaller particle, so it doesn't suddenly make it unsafe. If you cut it again, it wouldn't suddenly become unsafe. It's a fundamentally safe material. So it's a strange idea just to think that making these things smaller is going to somehow turn them into lethal chemicals. And another funny thing that they find, you'll find that these guys claim that plastics release toxins and harm marine wildlife. But the real studies show this, right? You take ocean water. So in that case, what they do, right, is they take polyethylene, they soak it in poison, and then they put it in the fish tank and go, look, the fish are poisoned, the plastic's releasing poison. And you're like, yeah, it's releasing the poison that you soaked it in to make it look bad. That's literally what these studies do. This is how shameful these people are. They soak the plastic in poison to poison the fish and then blame it on the plastic for releasing the poison. You could have soaked a sock in the poison and put it over there, or just poured the poison in with the fish. The plastic is not even playing a role, right? So here's the real experiment to decide whether plastics are poisoning fish. You take real ocean water, which is full of nasty chemicals, and you put in the microplastics. What happens? This experiment's been done. What happens is the plastic absorbs all the toxins and protects the fish. So the fish are actually healthier. And even if the fish eats the plastic, it's been proven that that piece of plastic loaded with toxin goes right through the fish, and the toxin remains within the plastic and protects the fish. That's the correct experiment. It's been done, and plastics are actually protecting these fish. But that story doesn't suit the narrative of these people who want you to open your pockets. So finally, we'll look at degradation. As I said, this all started with degradation because this is a topic I've been on television talking about, hernia and vaginal mesh and how it degrades in the body. These polymers are very, very unstable, and yet our children and the public believe that they're lasting for centuries. So this is just complete nonsense. So they did a study on plastic bags, as I mentioned. There are 2 peer-reviewed studies on regular plastic bags, comparing them to so-called green bags made of biodegradable materials. And they find that often the biodegradable material doesn't degrade. For example, in the ocean, they were able to fill it with shopping, and months later, and it was still just fine. So that's one thing that they find. And then they also find that the LDPE bag does degrade. So they found, here we are, that conventional plastic bag was compared to these other different types of bags under different conditions. After 9 months of exposure in open air, all the bags had disintegrated into fragments, and they went on to conclude that the oxo-degradable or biodegradable formulations didn't really help marine litter because they weren't giving any advantage over a regular bag which also decomposed. So you can take a regular polyethylene bag, 2 peer-reviewed studies, stick it outside in the sun, just as if you'd cast it on your garden, and it will be gone in less than a year. So why are we teaching our children it takes 1,000 years? So here's a rough comparison of to understand how plastics degrade. And we have to remember, plastics industry spends over $1 billion a year in stabilizers for plastics. We wouldn't be spending $1 billion for stabilizers for plastics if they were already stable, would we? That fact alone tells you that nobody's throwing away $1 billion for fun. The fact that the plastics industry has to spend billions a year to stabilize plastics tells you that right there that plastics are not stable. So here we have PE film lasts 1 to 3 years, or PP. Outdoors. Paper is about the same because these things are both held together by carbon-carbon bonds. It's the same chemistry. It's the same with leaves, carrots, or steak. If we look at a landfill, landfills are designed specifically with no oxygen, so things don't degrade. So saying that plastics are bad because they don't degrade in a landfill is ridiculous. Landfills are designed so that even food doesn't degrade in a landfill, and that's been measured. They've dug down in landfills and pulled this stuff up and seen that it doesn't degrade. They pull out carrots and newspapers from 50 years ago. And then another thing that will be levied against plastics is, they degrade to give CO2 and methane. And yeah, that's right. And so does paper, and so does sticks and wood, and everything organic degrades to the same thing. So that's not a particular knock on plastics. If you want to prevent degradation, stick it in a landfill. And then when you look at the life cycle analyses of these things, the plastic is the greenest of the choices. So they all have the same positives and negatives, apart from when we come to the life cycle analysis, and then we see plastic is probably what you should choose. So I'm going to talk about how do we get to this ridiculous situation where people are just believing a bunch of nonsense. And the reason is deception and greed. There have been two recent books. One's called Apocalypse Never, and the other one's called Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout. And both of these books are by people who are in the green movement, and they couldn't bear to be in it anymore. They realized that these people are totally anti-science. They discard all science. They don't even have scientists in many cases, and they publish complete nonsense and scare the pants off of the public in order to get their donations. So there have been two exposés recently from insiders who say, look, this is how these people behave. This is I can send you a whole report on this, or buy either of those books, and you'll see that some of these companies are actually losing. I mean, they get hundreds of millions, right, of donations by scaring people. So people who started off with good intentions can become, just a big business like any other. And they're even being having their I don't want to attack anyone in particular, but Greenpeace gets a lot of press. So if you do a search, they come up a lot. And you see that they're even losing their charitable status because governments are saying these guys are not providing a service that's helping anyone. So that's unfortunate, right? The public think that they can trust green groups, but in reality, they're just another business trying to make a buck out of this thing. And that's why we need scientists to come out, and we need somebody to present themselves as a strong lobby group, and not to lobby for plastics, but to lobby for truth. I'm not into lobbying for plastics. I just want people to have the facts so they can make smart decisions. So the conclusion is that plastics, especially these three, often turn out to be good green solutions to many of the things we use today. If we were to replace them, we will do tremendous damage. I mean, meaning vastly more CO2, way more energy, way more waste, and way more water usage. There is a litter problem in some places, but that's due to human behavior. Ocean plastic comes from places which are not the same places who are donating the money. And certain green groups are doing more harm than good because they're not really green groups. They're just mechanisms for raising money, it seems. So what should we do, right? We should use less material. We are wasteful, that's right. We should use less material. Don't take a straw. You want to be green? Don't take a straw. It's easy, right? Don't take a lid for your soft drink cup. That's absolutely right. Don't buy water in a plastic bottle, right? Just get it out of the tap. That's been proven to be greener, right? There are a lot of things we can do to be green, but demonizing plastics and replacing them with materials that are proven to do more harm is just silly. And it's not even silly. It's shocking and frightening because it's the future of our children, which we're throwing away based on misconceptions. So recycle, dispose of things properly, and so on. And prefer the greenest material, right? If that's wood, pick wood. Do a quick Google search. And if you can't decide, you can't quickly find information, as a rule of thumb, the thing which is lightest is often the greenest because there's less material there. Or the thing that's cheapest is often the greenest because when you add up a life cycle analysis, it's materials and transportation and all of these other things, many of the same things that go into making up the cost of the material. So if you take a plastic straw, it costs 1 cent and the paper straw costs 2 cents. The plastic one is lighter. It's 50% of the weight, and it turns out to be cheaper as well because it's greener. So ironically, the greenest solution is often the cheapest one. So here's my final thought I want to leave you with. You can be for the environment, or you can be against plastics, but you can't be both. So this is what I ask people who are so ardent against plastics. I'm like, are you more passionate against plastics than you are for the environment? Because that's what you're telling me. You're telling me that you don't care about facts, you don't care about science, you don't care about 24 life cycle analyses. You're still against plastics with a passion, even when I can prove to you that that's harming the environment. So ask yourself this: do you want to protect the environment, or do you get your jollies by fighting against plastics? And if you do, that's fine. I don't care. People are free to fight for whatever they want. I don't care, but I don't want them to be fighting for things based on a set of lies. That's not the way to progress. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and open the floor.